Hi there, I'm Geoff Moonen, actor, gamer, and one of the two hosts of Fun and Games podcast, which releases on this stream every other Friday as part of the larger Certain POV network. And today I wanted to talk about one of my favorite video games of all time, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, first released for PlayStation 1 by Konami in 1997. Symphony of the Night stands as a very interesting title, whether as a fulcrum point or a pivot or a frontier, however you want to think about it. We'll get into that later. The game was directed by Toru Hagihara, who was the director of Rondo of Blood, of which Symphony is a direct sequel, despite the fact that Rondo of Blood did not really have a coherent Western release, only the extremely watered-down Dracula X for the Super Nintendo. The more well-known name behind this game is Koji Igarashi, who served as assistant director and one of the scenario writers. He'd go on to produce the next 10 plus years of Castlevania releases, and a lot of those ideas started right here in Symphony of the Night. Symphony stands as one of the shining examples of a Metroidvania, a sort of gated, non-linear adventure that has had many developments and continues to be a fertile bed for game development to this day. Despite the fact that Symphony of the Night is one of the reasons why it is a Metroidvania, and the similarities that Symphony and Metroid have that help solidify the genre, a large part of Symphony's inspiration lie in The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past in particular, Igarashi himself citing the focus on exploration and defining the thing that unlocks the next area. I first played it because one day back in 1998, my older brother was at Blockbuster and wanted to rent Blood Omen: Legacy of Kain, a completely different PS1 game about vampires and monsters with Zelda influences and very notable voiceover. He couldn't remember the title, only that it had vampires. And honestly, the stormy castle silhouette on Symphony's cover ticked that box way better than Blood Omen's does. I don't remember at what point during that rental exactly Symphony of the Night got its claws into me, but they've never let go. Symphony was my first Castlevania game, which was pretty handy for me because it does stand as the fulcrum between the classic Castlevanias that came before and the Metroidvanias that followed. This was such a new game to me that the first time I played it, I remember avoiding the first few save rooms because I didn't know what they were. The rental didn't have the manual for the game, and all I could tell was there were these random rooms where the music would cut out, just like they would do when you entered a boss room. And all they would have is this strange, floating, geometric shape that pulsed with a heartbeat. I eventually figured it out, but it was incredibly evocative. As for the game itself, it sets itself up as a seamless sequel to Rondo of Blood. You begin your adventure in Symphony, destroying Dracula as Richter Belmont, Rondo's hero, and the castle holds the aftermath of this adventure. For the majority of the game, you take on the role of Alucard, Dracula's half-human son. You walk into the castle potent and powerful, with a full set of very powerful equipment, only to have that power stripped within the first few rooms by Death himself. A recurring character in the Castlevania series, but I didn't know that at the time. Then, the adventure proper begins. As you progress through the game, you find weapons and armor of gradually increasing strength, dropped at random by felled foes, or in the nooks and crannies of the castle, whether in far-off rooms or behind destroyable walls and floors. You gain relics that unlock new abilities, like double jump, or different shape-shifting forms to aid in mobility, familiars that aid you in combat and exploration, and even some simpler utilities like displaying how much damage you're actually dealing to an enemy, or the name of that enemy in question. Every enemy you destroy gives you some amount of experience points that allow you to level up and grow even more powerful. Some may argue too powerful, but I think that's part of the game's charm. Despite standing as the first Metroidvania and a vast departure from the other Castlevanias that came previously, the game does carry a lot of classic design and callbacks. The very first relic you receive, just 2 rooms after losing your equipment to death, gives you an ability that all of the other human protagonists before you had by default. The ability to get pickup items like sub-weapons and hearts that fuel them to drop from any candles that you can destroy nearby. While this feels a little arbitrary, this does set up the notion of exploration and growth brilliantly, without it being a thing you have to think about. Every time you defeat a boss, they drop a little Technicolor potion that would refill your life and even raise your HP max by a little bit. This bridged RPG design for level ups, as well as the boss orbs that would drop at the end of regular classic Castlevania levels after you defeat the boss. Although these HP max ups definitely contribute to the easier difficulty of Symphony of the Night. Areas of the castle resemble previous iterations. The opening of Symphony of the Night's castle is a fairly open interpretation of the very first level of Castlevania, complete with a healing food item exactly where you'd find it on the NES. With these classic stage remixes, they also brought some of the classic traps like spikes and collapsing ceilings. But since this is a bit more of an RPG rather than a side-scrolling adventure game, they wouldn't result in instant death, just massive damage. But this is the only game I can think of, Castlevania or otherwise, that allows you to get revenge on spikes, thanks to the spike breaker armor you can find later on. Several of the relics that are required for the best possible ending of the game were the same 5 pieces of Dracula you had to collect in Castlevania II: Simon's Quest, and you receive them from defeating 5 bosses that are updated versions of the original Castlevania 1 bosses. Now there was another Castlevania game on NES, Castlevania 3, which was Alucard's first appearance. The other playable characters from that adventure show up as bosses later on, in sort of an oblique way. And to top it all off, during every single one of the endings in this game, you look upon the castle ruins from a cliff, just like you do in the classics. All of this cool history and stuff being said, the game just feels good to play. In a lot of other action games, I'd normally hold down a run button or spam the dash button or otherwise fiddle with ways to move faster. Alucard has a certain fluidity in his animation and an otherworldly shadow effect that, despite the fact that there are some very odd-looking ways to move very fast, sometimes it just feels right to run around. And the design of the game in general is just beautiful. Alucard just oozes style and late 90s gothic cool. There's a reason this is the version of Alucard they use in the Netflix series, and not the NES version. The monsters you face come in all shapes and sizes with varying patterns, movement styles, and carry the anachronistic hodgepodge that I just delight in throughout the whole Castlevania series. Now, a lot of design ideas in the game are a little haphazard. There's a rudimentary magic system. One of the spells giving you Dracula's iconic teleport and shoot 3 fireballs attack. Most of these spells are rarely, if ever, useful in-game, but they're very cool nevertheless. There are no obstacles that require their usage, and the only magic spells that consume MP that I would find myself using are the dash abilities for Alucard's bat and wolf forms. I didn't really get into exploring the spells except for the sake of completion, but my favorite spell of all of them is Dark Metamorphosis. True to Alucard's half-vampiric nature, blood is something that is within the game, that you can interact with, that you could take or leave. Dark Metamorphosis would temporarily allow you to drink blood to regain health. Of course, the enemy had to bleed for it to have any effect. Can't exactly draw blood from a bone. There's an early enemy called the Bloody Zombie that just high-pressure sprays blood and screams with every hit, telegraphing the existence of blood without giving you any connection as to why. Any other blood effect from an enemy just kind of goes along with all the other particle effects that happen. So while it's not hard to find, you do have to look for it. You do have to choose to engage with it. I didn't really cast Dark Metamorphosis for its healing properties. I cast it so I could hear Alucard yell the spell's name in anguish as he holds his arms up to his face and begins to glow red. So stylish. And not just the magic system, there's so many items and elements of design of this game that are one-shot or obscure. But given that this is a game where you explore the castle and delve, these are things worth hunting, and they're some of my favorite things to find. A large percentage of the weapons that you find have some kind of ability that can be activated by doing one of a few button combinations that are universal across weapons. And part of the joy whenever you found a new weapon, even if it wasn't any stronger than what you already had, was equipping it and seeing what it could do. Sometimes it would just be an interesting particle effect when you swiped, and other times it'd be things like the Sword of Dawn, which would summon spectral warriors, the Jewel Sword, which would summon small amounts of coin and raise your chances of turning enemies into sellable gems, the Fist of Tulkas, which gave you a fireball attack, and all kinds of others. Things like the Shield Rod, which utterly could break the game in the right combination. And one of my favorites out of all of them was the Muramasa. Muramasa wasn't activated with any sort of button combination. It was simply described as a bloodthirsty sword, which indirectly meant it would ever so slightly, ever so slowly grow stronger with every foe you killed that bled. Now, there's no experience bars to this or any progress to it, but I definitely passed casual hangout time in my dorm room freshman year of college, just not even looking at the screen, just talking to friends and mindlessly slashing at the endlessly spawning mermen in the castle entrance, because I wanted to see how strong it could get. I still have that save file, I should check that. There'd be other interesting little rooms and corners that had nothing to do with items. In the Royal Chapel area, there was a small confessional room that had no items, no fights, no enemies. But if you sat in either of the chairs, a ghost would appear and sit in the other. If you sat in the priest's chair, a woman would come to confess. If you sat in the confessional chair, a priest would arrive. Sometimes they did what you would expect, whether confessing and thanking you or absolving you of your sins, but other times they'd laugh, close the curtain, and stab you. There's nothing that came out of that, but I spent way too much time having fun with it. And these are the things that I love about the game. They contribute to a title worth exploring and returning to again and again. Part of the rough edges on the game are due to the fact that 1997 was a time when we were really catching up to the idea that a good localization can really make a game great. And Symphony of the Night's script was localized by Jeremy Blaustein, who also brought us the localization for the original Metal Gear Solid, so thank you, Jeremy. You can thank him for the iconic line, "What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets." Itself a reference to the French novelist André Malraux. True, Malraux's words came over a century later, but if you're playing Castlevania for historical accuracy, there's not much I can do for you. But that localization is brought to meme-tacular life by the voice acting. Several members of the cast did appear in other games at the time, including Tekken, Time Crisis. The voice of Dracula was the voice of Harry Mason, the protagonist for Silent Hill. Robert Belgrade, the voice of Alucard on the PS1 version, did get to sort of spiritually reprise the role in Bloodstained Ritual of the Night as OD, the librarian vampire. And also, David Hayter from Metal Gear Solid was a character in that game. Interesting. And I can't get through this without talking about the music from Symphony of the Night. Even if you never play the game, you can enjoy this spectacular soundtrack that utilizes a few remixes of previous titles, but the vast majority of it is new, composed by Michiru Yamane. This was only her second Castlevania title, but she would go on to compose music for all of Igarashi's Castlevania games and contribute to Bloodstained's soundtrack as well. That partnership began here. Unique to the original PS1 release of the game are two tracks. A bonus track called Dracula's Castle that you can only access if you put the actual CD itself into a CD player and play track 2. Don't play track 1. Any PS1 game's track 1 is just computer data, and you could ruin your speakers because of all of the weird dial-up internet computer noises that translate. And in fact, at the beginning of Dracula's Castle, you have Robert Belgrade warning you that this is a PlayStation Black Disc. Cut number 1 contains computer data. A little late to be warning us, but what can you do? I think I first discovered that track during one of the many long car trips my family would make from New Jersey to Vermont and back to visit family. I'd bring my Discman, some music CDs, as well as some PlayStation 1 games to play at my cousin's house. So I've definitely a few times put the discs in there to see if they had soundtracks, and I think I first heard it there. The other unique track is the credits song, I Am the Wind, which I don't think appears in later titles because of licensing issues, because it does have a vocalist. And that vocalist, this is only one of her 2 video game singing credits, Cynthia Harrell. And her other video game singing credit? The title song for Metal Gear Solid 3, Snake Eater. What I'm saying here is I love Symphony of the Night and Metal Gear Solid, and when Psycho Mantis and Metal Gear told me that I liked Castlevania before the fight, it felt very well earned, and my brother and I both had a minor freak-out moment. It was great. Now, Symphony of the Night is one of those games that nowadays is spoke of in hallowed tones and is well loved, but It's easy to forget that this game was released within weeks of Final Fantasy VII. The world didn't want pixel graphics. They didn't want 2D. They wanted sweeping, cinematic 3D games. And the only noticeable 3D elements of Symphony of the Night are the opening and closing cinematics, which they outsourced, and even the team at Konami was disappointed with them. But the game has aged very well thanks to its light touch approach to 3D. There are 3D aspects throughout, but they're subtle. And while Final Fantasy VII's state-of-the-art graphics stay in 1997, Symphony feels a little more perennial. The game did eventually sell fairly well. It reached over 700,000 units after word of mouth spread about the game's quality. To compare though, Final Fantasy VII sold 3 times as well as that within its first 3 days, but over 700,000 is enough to garner a greatest hits release, so I'd call that a win. And like I said, many of the game and map design ideas haven't aged fantastically. Some roadblocks are overly obtuse. The sheer glut and litany of redundant equipment is palpable. But part of what I love about the PlayStation 1 in general was how many ideas got thrown against the wall to see what stuck, and I'm very happy many game makers have learned well from the bold experiments of Symphony of the Night. Yes, it is a wonderful title, it's one of my favorite games, but it's full of little issues. I found a tweet by Takayuki Fuji, one of the musicians from Symphony's soundtrack, who went on record and pointed out that he didn't even tune his guitar on the take they used for the track The Tragic Prince. I can't unhear it, and now neither can you. I think the greatest summation of all of these wild frontier ideas can be summarized with the reverse castle. Hidden past the first gate of endings, the true villains reveal themselves, and another castle descends from the clouds, identical in structure to the castle you just spent hours exploring, only flipped vertically. Now, design choices that seemed purely aesthetic in the first castle now hold new secrets and dangers. Breakable passageways in the floor are now in the ceiling, and vice versa. There are far harder foes and challenges in every part of the reverse castle, no matter what direction you go. Some utilize these differences beautifully. What was once a long and steep flight of stairs in the Royal Chapel is now a track for cog-wheeled platforms for archers to pick you off from just out of reach. What was stylish filigree extending into the ceilings of an early area now hide fast-moving spike traps that strike as soon as you touch down on what is now the floor. However, for every inspired choice, there's areas that are simply named reverse whatever the area was in the first castle. And several share the same music track, Final Toccata, which, while a beautiful track, don't get me wrong, it stands out in a game where up until that point, every area had its own unique music track that would start after you came in through the loading hallways that cut out the music for just that moment. The whole idea of the reverse castle could be seen by some as lazy design, or as a bold, overreaching step into explosive nonlinearity. A place where you finally recover your original equipment and get to experience one of gaming's notoriously hardest castles as the badass superhuman Alucard. Which is just Dracula spelled backwards after all, so is the backwards castle just one long riff on that? So much of what was established or codified in Symphony would have more systemized paths in later titles, whether by side quest menus, tighter item lists, the long list of equipments getting grouped together and made into more bite-sized souls or systems. But part of the charm is just how absolutely unmoored all of it is. Don't get me wrong, I love how well organized everything is in later titles, but there is something nice about getting to go back to this one, and it just all feels so fresh, so wild. Despite being nearly 25 years old, Castlevania Symphony of the Night is still fairly accessible to play. You can play it on the PlayStation 1, you can technically play it on the Saturn, but for all of the rough edges of the PS1, the Saturn's even rougher. You can play it on the PSP as an unlockable part of the Dracula X Chronicles. You can play it on PS3 and PS Vita as a digital PS1 classic. And probably most accessible is part of the Castlevania Requiem collection released in 2018 on the PS4. Now, that version of Symphony is built on the PSP version from Dracula X Chronicles, and that version rather infamously updated the script and voiceover. If that doesn't bother you, the game is still the same. It is a wonderful title, and if you're still missing those iconic lines and hammy over-the-top acting, there's YouTube. If you've never played Castlevania Symphony of the Night before, I do recommend giving it a try. It's one of the more accessible Castlevania titles, certainly of the earlier ones, and by word of mouth and what I can get from people, it still holds up even for those who have no nostalgia for it. And if you have played Symphony of the Night before, now's a great time to return, to go out this evening for pleasure. The night is still young. I'm Geoff Moonen. Happy gaming.